Righto.
So you're recording now.
Well, I remember when I was born in Banbridge. Well, I don't quite remember that far back, but I do remember being in Banbridge. And when we moved, when I was 3 years old, from Banbridge out to the country near the Believy Bleaching Company. And we were in a lovely 2-story stucco house. I had my own big bedroom with a casement window that looked out over our large back garden, and beyond that, the linen fields, and beyond that, there was a train going over a bridge, and beyond that were purple mountains of Mourne. I remember standing on that fence in the back garden and looking over the linen fields, and the men would come along with the carts, and they would bring out the linen there, and they would lay it out on the fields, and they would lay it out so that they touched close together in that field. And the reason for that, they told me, was because they didn't want the bunnies hopping out and running over it. Sometimes they bring a bunny over to me and I get a chance to pet one. Along the side of the linen field, along far down from our house, there was the road that went down to the Believy Bleaching Company. And my daddy used to disappear down that road along with all the sea of black bicycles and people riding them down to the Believy Bleaching Company to work, whatever that was. And then they would all come waving back in the evening. What was this work, I wondered. And so one day, I escaped from that garden. I went down that road to the Believy Bleaching Company. Oh, these massive big buildings they were. Well, I was only 3 years old, you know. They looked gargantuan. There was a huge door, and I went in through that door, and the noise in there, and the smell was like laundry day at my grandmother's, where she would put on her clothes to a boil. And over my head was running a road of linen. It was going over rollers and down into vats and up again and over and down into another vat. Well, just then, a lady came over to me, dressed in her apron and her hair done up in the scarves like you've seen in the pictures of way back in the day. And she said to me, "What are you doing here, wee girl?" And I said, "I've come to see my daddy." "And who's your daddy?" "Well, I'm Olwyn and he's my daddy." And well, some lady there recognized me, and off I was picked up and taken into the offices where my daddy worked. And of course, was taken home. Well, you know, back in the old days, that job of all of that bleaching and laying and all of the steps before that, the weaving and the spinning and the carding and the baking of the flax, it was all done in homes, in farms, and the men would take the flax and start the process and get it up to being carded, and then the women would take over with the spinning and the weaving, and then of course it was either sold or made into clothes. Well, in one of those old days, you know, back long ago and once upon a time when pigs were swine, there lived an old woman, a widow in County Down, and she had a daughter named Nabla. Well, this girl Nabla, I have to tell you, she was good for nothing. She was a lazy girl. She would sit by the fire toasting her toes and drinking a cup of tea and do nothing to help her mother at all. Would you get up and do this? Would you get up and do that? And Nabla, well, she just didn't move at all. Well, finally, her mother was just at the end of her tether. And oh my goodness, the screaming and the shouting and the barney that was going on in there, well, she couldn't have switched her more with a stick than she did with her tongue. And just at that moment, a great prince came along. He was coming by the house. He stopped. He heard the barney going on inside. He jumped off his horse and up to the door he went. Well, the woman came to the door And she recognized the prince there. And of course, she curtsies right away. And the prince says to her, well, listen, what's going on in this house? What a shout match I've heard. What on earth is the commotion? And the woman, well, not wanting her daughter to be dishonored in any way, said to the prince, well, you know, it's my daughter. My daughter. She works and works. She works her fingers to the bone. Why? She doesn't stop working. In fact, I've had to shout and yell and push her down in a chair to make her stop. And the prince said, what kind of work does she do? Well, she spins and she weaves and she sews and all of those womanly tasks that you know. And she's excellent at it, most excellent. Well, isn't she just the sort of woman I've been looking for? And indeed, a year ago, the prince had announced that he was looking for a wife. And of course, his mother, being a good Irish mother, said, I'll find a wife for you. And girls would come to the palace and they would be tested, but they were not the sort that would marry her son. Well, the prince said to Nabla, you know, you are just the sort of woman my mother would love, and I think you've got to come with me. And he pulled her up onto the horse and off he went. Well, they got back to the palace, and of course he introduced the young girl to his mother and told her, mother, this is the girl we've been looking for. Why, she can spin and sew and weave. Mother, she can do, in fact, she can do these things so well, her mother had to make her stop. And the queen said, right, well, she'll still pass my test. And she took Nabla to a little room and set her down in there. And in that room, there was a silver spinning wheel. And beside it, there was a heap of very finely carded flax fiber. And she said to the girl, Nabla, you just spin this into the finest thread you can, and I'll be back. And out she went and closed the door. Well, Nabla, she sat down, she looked at that fiber, and she looked at the spinning wheel, and she looked at the fiber, and she looked at the spinning wheel, she looked at the fiber, and she burst out crying. And just then, an old woman appeared right there in the room beside her. What are you crying about? Said the woman. And Nabla said, the queen wants me to spin all that into fine thread, and I don't know how to spin. And the old woman said, well, right you are. I'll spin it all for you under one condition, that you bid me to your wedding. I'll do that and all, says Nabla. And so the woman sat down, spinned it all in no time at all into the most beautiful thread you've ever seen. And the queen came back, she looked at that thread, she said, that's good. And the next day she took Nabla back into the room, and in there now there was a golden loom, a golden shuttle, and a golden spindle with all of the wool upon it. Now, I've got to tell you, that last woman that did all that spinning, she was a bit of a peculiar woman, you know. She had a great, huge foot. She had the foot the size of a bolster. It was enormous, and she had hobbled out of that room as fast as anything. But now, Nabla was faced with this problem. Here was a thread. Here was a loom. Here was the shuttle. And what was she going to do now? She looked at the thread. She looked at the shuttle. She looked at the loom. She looked at the thread. She looked at the shuttle. She looked at the loom, and she began to cry. One thing she was very good at was crying. And an old woman appeared just then beside her. Now, this old woman didn't have a big foot. She had an immense hand. that sunk all the way down to the side of her and kept her off balance at all times. "What you crying about?" said the old woman. "Well," says Nabla, "I've got thread, I've got a spinning wheel, and I got a shovel, and the queen wants me to put this all into fabric, and I don't even know how to put a shovel, and I..." "All right," said the old woman, "I'll do it for you. Under one condition, you invite me to your wedding." And so the old woman, she went ahead and she just twacked that shovel through the loom, twacked it through the loom, and before you knew it, she had all of this fine fabric made. And she folded it carefully, and she wrapped it up in brown paper, as you should do with very fine linen. And then she was gone. And the queen returned. And the queen looked at the fiber. She looked at the fabric. She felt it. She said, "That's good." And the next day, she took Nabla back to the room, and she handed her golden needles, golden thimble, golden shears, and she said, "Take this lovely fabric now and make it into shirts for my son. I'll be back." And she left and locked the door for the third time. And Nabla looked at the needles, looked at the thimble, looked at the shears, looked at the fabric, and yes, she cried. And just then an old woman appeared at her side. Now this old woman had a nose the size of I don't know what. It was so heavy that she was bent way over. And the old woman said to her, "What are you crying for?" And Nabla said, "Well, I've got all this fabric, and I've got needles and thread. The queen wants me to make shirts for the prince, and I don't even know how to thread a needle." "Oh, I'll do it for you," said the old woman, "under one condition. You bid me to your wedding." "Oh, I'll do that and all," says Nabla. And so the old woman sat down and she cut. She put the pieces together and she leaned over and she began to sew with her nose way down to the floor, tiny, 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 tiny stitches, until she had made the most beautiful shirt you've ever seen. Lovely, soft, lovely fit, beautiful shirts. Oh, they looked lovely. And the queen came back, and the woman was gone before she'd been seen. And the queen looked at the shirts and she said, "All right, you may marry my son." Well, the cheers through the whole palace, I cannot tell you. The rejoicing. Finally, they found the woman for this prince to marry. And the wedding banquet was set, and the party began, and the music began, and then, bang, bang, at the door. The servant went and answered the great palace door. In walked an old woman with this great big bolster of a foot. Ka-thump, 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 all the way down the hall until she reached the wedding couple. "Welcome to our wedding," said the prince. "And by whose bidding are you here?" "Oh, the bride's," the old woman said. And she sat down at the table. A place was made for her properly, of course. And in the course of the conversation, the prince leaned over and said, "Would you mind me asking, why do you have one huge foot?" "Oh," said the woman, "you see, from I was any age at all, my foot has been on the treadle of the spinning wheel, and I have spun and spun my whole life long, and all the blood has rushed to my foot, and it's always been this big." Well, the prince's eyes widened. He stood up, he smacked the table. He said, "My wife will from this day forward never spin another yard of thread. And all the court nodded and sat down. And the party struck up again. And bang, bang, bang at the door, in came another old woman. She had the hand the size of a frying pan. And she hobbled, ka-think, ka-think, ka-think. And she dragged that hand all the way down the length of the hall until she got to the wedding couple. "Welcome to our wedding," said the prince. "And by whose bidding are you here?" "Oh, the bride's," said the old woman. And so a place was made for her at the table, and they sat, and the party began again. And the prince, well, in the course of the conversation, leaned over and said very politely, "Excuse me, but might I ask, why do you have one huge hand?" "Oh," said the old woman, "from I was any age at all, I have weaved, and I've smacked that shuttle back and forth and back and forth until the blood has rushed to my hand, and it's remained this big ever since." The prince's eyes widened. He took in a breath. He stood up. He smacked the table. "From this day forward, my wife will not weave 1 yard of cloth." And all the court nodded. And then the party began again. And yes, bang, bang, bang. And in came the other old woman. Her nose the size of a don't know what, all the way down to the floor. And hunched over, she dragged herself down that wall to the wedding couple. "Welcome to our wedding," said the prince. "And by whose bidding are you here?" "Oh, the bride's," said the old woman. And a place was made for her at the table, and they all sat down, and the party struck up again. Now, in the course of the conversation, and I must say the prince was very delicate about this, because you know how ladies are with their faces. He leaned over and he very politely asked, "Might I just inquire how it is that you came to have such a huge nose?" And the old woman said, "Oh, well, you see, from I was any age at all, I have sewed. I have sewed fabric with tiny, 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 tiny stitches. Oh, it was lovely work, but all the blood rushed to my nose, and it's been that size ever since." Well, the prince's eyes popped. He took in a breath. His mouth dropped. He stood up. He banged on the table. He said, "I declare from this time forward, my wife will not sew, not weave, not spin, do no manner of work." And do you know what? The prince was true to his word. And just to prove how true he was, he had a group of servants assigned to watch Nabla day and night to make sure that she did no manner of work. And Nabla was very good and always did what the prince told her. She invited her mother to come and live at the palace, and they all lived happily ever after, Nabla as lazy as the day she was born.